galaxy so far away, Middle-earth. The Death Star came, the elves turned to Sauron and said, oh, please, Dark Sauron, won't you make some rings for the hobbits and the Wookiee kings, for the elves and the Jedi Council too. Oh, please, Darth Thanatar, upon the Death Star with Elrond, a Wookiee and me.
So I was noticing some headlines about the Acolyte, which I hadn't thought about in a while. But actually, thinking about the Acolyte while watching The Rings of Power, it's kind of amazing how many similarities there are. Not necessarily in the story, but in just sort of how, we've got The Rings of Power, which has taken the works of Tolkien and sort of turned it into amateur hour, right? It's got the trappings of Tolkien, the trappings of the Lord of the Rings, sort of the visual aesthetic that we got in the Peter Jackson movies, and a lot of the characters and all that. Sort of like in the Acolyte, we have this attempt at Star Wars, but it ends up feeling much more like fan fiction. Everything looks a little cheap. The writing is really, really amateurish, for lack of a better term. The story is riddled with plot holes, conveniences. I mean, these shows are wildly similar in so many ways. And just in the nature of both these shows are taking a beloved IP, a beloved franchise, a beloved fictional world, universe, mythos, lore, all that stuff. And then they're like, hey, let's throw it all into this AI algorithm and let's see what pops out the other side. They both feel very much like maybe stories that would be, crafted by AI or just by people who are not actually very good storytellers and then made into shows by people who really don't have a great understanding of filmmaking, frankly. Both of these series also feel very small. They're both, the Acolyte takes place in the Star Wars galaxy far, far away, but every single scene feels very small. It's partly how it's filmed. Same with the Rings of Power, where every scene is really zoomed in on all the characters, and it all feels like it's being shot on movie sets, and it all feels like there's not much scope. The Rings of Power at least has some establishing shots that show big sweeping hills and mountains and all that stuff. But once we're actually in a moment with the characters, it's all very zoomed in and it's all very claustrophobic, and it starts to feel sort of cheap and small. Like the world, and then the fast travel in that show also makes the world feel very, very small. The world feels geographically small. And the condensed timeline makes it feel temporally constricted and small. Everything about this epic sweeping second age of Middle-earth feels small. And the Acolyte is the same thing. Everything feels small. Now, granted, you have, obviously you have fast travel in Star Wars, but in every world they go to, in every location, again, you have this problem where it feels like you're just, like the cinematography is just extraordinarily unimaginative. And the places and the people you encounter all feel very locked in and very constricted by this very, I don't know what to call it other than amateurish filmmaking. But the reason that I stumbled on the Acolyte is just people keep talking about this petition. There's a petition that has been, signed by 72,000 people roughly on change.org. And people are like, look at that. Look how many people. That's so many people. But I also know of another petition for another show that was just canceled after one season. That is My Lady Jane. Now, I made a video review of this a while ago. My Lady Jane is not like any other shows that I usually cover on this channel. But I liked it. Now, a lot of people are like, I can't believe you liked that. It's so woke or whatever else. Yeah. I have eclectic taste. But the point is not whether or not My Lady Jane is good or bad, or whether you'll like it, or if I'm crazy for liking it. That's just beside the point. And I'll get to a little bit more of that in a minute. But the point is that there's a petition to renew My Lady Jane with 66,000 signatures, and another one with 12,000. Probably some of those are duplicate signatures. So we'll just say 66,000. That is just 6,000 fewer signatures than the Acolyte has, for a show that most people have never heard of, based on a book that most people have never heard of, on Amazon Prime. So you have a show that's brand new to most people, that most people haven't heard of, getting 66,000 signatures, versus The Acolyte, which is a Star Wars show, one of the biggest intellectual properties in entertainment, with just 72,000 signatures. To me, this says two things. It says that the audience for My Lady Jane is very passionate about this and would really like to get this show renewed and a reversal on the cancellation. Because there just aren't that, I mean, compared to Star Wars, there are not that many fans of this show. So, contrarily, you have The Acolyte with just 72,000. Now, that's Star Wars with millions and millions of fans that has been building those fans for decades. And it just has just 72,000, just 6,000 more than My Lady Jane. And here's where I get to my next point. Whatever you feel about My Lady Jane, if you've watched it or not, this is a romance, right? It's a romantic, ahistorical, romantic dramedy, right? It's about Lady Jane Grey. It takes a very upfront, flagrant, anti-historical view. There are like magical people called Ethians who can turn into animal form. It's very diverse, all that stuff, but it's very much doing its thing for its audience, right? Romance, and I've talked about this before, but romance is geared towards women. My Lady Jane is very obviously a show with the target audience of women, just like most romance everything is. Star Wars is a series that has historically been a male-driven demographic. The majority of Star Wars fans are men or boys. The majority, not all. Star Wars, unlike a romance, has much broader appeal. So you're much more likely to have, women and girls, people of all ages, people of all races, who enjoy Star Wars because it does have broad appeal. That broad appeal is part of the fundamental nature of Star Wars, which is it's an adventure, it's a good versus evil story, very similar to Lord of the Rings in a lot of ways, right? Which also has very broad appeal. But fundamentally, both Star Wars and Lord of the Rings their core demographic is male. Whereas romances like My Lady Jane, female. Now, what's happened with Star Wars, and I've talked about this before, is that there's been this concerted effort not just to continue making Star Wars a broadly appealing thing, but to sort of try to replace that demographic and say, okay, the Force is female. We're going to make shows and movies that are, and lead characters constantly trying to make the audience more female forward. But see, that just doesn't work because that's not the core audience for Star Wars. And what's happened is you've started to alienate the core audience, the more male audience. And my theory that I've posited before is that this has a negative effect on female viewership also, because for as long as it's been around, Star Wars and Marvel and a lot of these sort of broad appeal type sci-fi fantasy type shows, there's been what I call the half-interested girlfriend effect. So it's appealing mainly to men, but then the men bring their wives or their girlfriends, their kids. They bring their friend and their friend brings his wife. You get a lot of women going to these things that might not go see because they're broadly appealing, but they go see them because their boyfriends or their husbands are excited about them. So you get that add-on effect. So it's not just boys and men going to see these. It's all sorts of people. It's a broadly appealing thing. Similar to how rom-coms and, movies like The Notebook and all this stuff, there's a male audience there, mostly because they're the half-interested boyfriend, right? So you have husbands and boyfriends showing up to romance movies, to chick flicks for their women, right? Because they want to go on the date and they want to make their lady happy and all that, right? And they usually, a lot of these are enjoyable, right? And it's fun to go because, you're with your girl. Now, if the romance business was not, I think it's a very successful, romance novels, the romance business is a very successful slice of the larger entertainment industry, right? What they haven't done, and what I don't expect them to do, is to start saying, what we really need? So we really need to say that romance movies are actually for men. We need to start gearing our books, our movies, our series, we need to start targeting the male demographic. Because what's going to happen is if they do that, it's going to be a watered down romance that women aren't going to like as much, but men are still not going to go watch. And then so the women don't go, so then the half-interested boyfriends and the half-interested husbands don't go. And so instead of like building this new male audience for romance stuff, you just lose both female and male audience, potential viewers, whatever, readers, at the same time. And that's exactly what's happening in Marvel and in Star Wars and in these places where they've stopped remembering who their target audience is. They've stopped appealing to the core demographic. And so not only do men and boys find themselves less and less interested with the shows like The Acolyte, but their girlfriends and their wives, their kids, everyone else who they've historically brought with them also falls off. And you just have a fall-off effect. Your ratings go down. And this is why Disney and Lucasfilm need to say, okay, they need to answer some questions, right? First of all, when it comes to this stuff, who is the target audience and what is the core demographic? Those are two different questions. The target audience for The Acolyte seems to be not the core demographic for Star Wars. That's a problem. Who's buying the merchandise? Who's bringing people to the movies? Who's spreading word of mouth? Again, if that's not lining up with your target audience, you've got a problem. Now, I'm not saying, and this is what like detractors of this argument will say. They'll say, "Oh, you just don't want women in Star Wars." Absolutely, that's totally not true. Since the beginning, we've had Princess Leia, first of all, but even in shows like Andor, which are much, much newer, we have lots of great female characters. I think most people, like 99% of people, like to have good female characters in things like Star Wars and Marvel. They might start to chafe at the idea that every single Star Wars show or movie should have a female main character. Because again, this is a male-dominated genre. Similar, right? In romance, I'm going to keep going back and forth here. Most romances have great male characters also. You got to have somebody for the protagonist to fall in love with. Sometimes two, because love triangles are a big thing in romance, right? Lots of great male characters in romance, but often the female character is the lead protagonist, the one that the reader or the viewer relates to, right? Look at Twilight, right? Bella Swan. I've read like 4 pages of Twilight and I was like, no, this is not for me. I've never watched the movies, but I know that the main character is a female character. Now, if you started having all the main characters of romance novels and romance be the men, that would be a problem. But you don't want to get rid of the male characters. That would be also very, very stupid. The point being that Disney and Lucasfilm need to say, okay, what is the core demographic of Star Wars, and how do we appeal to that demographic so that we can make money and have a thriving community and have successful movies? I mean, there's lots of other questions they need to ask also. Like, here's one. Why did we make a trilogy of Star Wars movies without an overall plan? What is our plan for Star Wars? Let's make that. But you have to have that first question answered first. Also, another one, what are the core values and messages that you want to convey through these stories? I don't mean political messages, but just like deeper themes, thematic. The thematic nature of Star Wars is, again, very much like Lord of the Rings. It's a story of good versus evil. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. You don't want to mess with that too much. You can't constantly be subverting expectations. You can't constantly be saying, like, people are like, oh, The Acolyte was so fresh because it was an examination of the darker side of the Jedi and all this. And it's like, no, they've been doing that since the prequels. The Jedi are much, much less interesting and compelling than they were when it was just Luke Skywalker in Return of the Jedi, coming back, this mysterious sort of lone ranger, the last knight. That's more interesting than constantly like examining what's wrong with the Jedi. Like, we've got that. We've got it. We get it. Okay. That's not the point. The point of Star Wars. The point of Star Wars is a struggle between good and evil. Same with Lord of the Rings, a struggle between good and evil. There are plenty of other stories out there that are more shades of gray. You don't need to do it with everything. Haven't we had enough of the obsession with anti-heroes and shades of gray in everything? Like, it's already been done really well. We've had a lot of great anti-heroes. It doesn't need to be in everything. It's another problem with Rings of Power where they try to make, so many of these characters more shades of gray, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't work there. Probably partly because they're just so bad at it. But point being, if you appeal to your core audience, you get a reaction like My Lady Jane, right? Where people are passionate. The fan base, the core demographic is passionate to try to renew this show, which was probably just expensive. And because it was new, it probably didn't do the kind of big numbers that shows need to do to survive. And it's a shame because it was a well-done show that understood its audience. Whereas The Acolyte, almost the exact same number means a very different thing. It means that people were not showing up for this. Either they don't like it, or they just don't care, or enough bad word of mouth had gotten around, or whatever. But the numbers kept falling with each episode because it really was a bad show. And part of that is just that that Disney does not have an idea of who it's actually supposed to be making Star Wars for. And again, not just for, but you have to understand your core audience. And then that core audience, if they're happy, brings everybody else in also. By all means, let's have female Jedi. Do you know how cool a Carrie-Anne Moss Jedi series could have been? Like, come on, that was a no-brainer. By all means, have diversity. Andor is a super diverse show, and it is phenomenal. The point of the diversity was just, it's a diverse universe. It wasn't trying to shove some sort of DEI message on viewers, right? It was just diverse, organically so. One more comment I wanted to make about romance is that we've seen in the romance publishing industry the rise of romantic fantasy. I'm sure there's like an abbreviation for that, but stuff like The Fourth Wing or A Court of Thorns and Roses and all these other like romance fantasies have risen up. And this is another example of how you can start to appeal to different audiences, to a more female audience, organically by a genre sort of building up out of pre-existing the romance and the fantasy genres coming together, rather than saying like, oh, we're going to make Star Wars appeal more to women. Like, look at all this potential you have with this genre that has become wildly popular. And these authors have sold millions of copies of these books, which are appealing to a different set of fantasy fans than like something like, a lot of the historically male-driven fantasy genre. That's all I have to say about that. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments.
Oh, please, Lord Sauron, won't you make some rings for the hobbits and the Wookiee kings, for the elves and the Jedi Council too? Yeah, oh please, Darth Thanatar, up on the Death Star with Elrond, a Wookiee and